Hi, this week we are joined by Head of Social Media at Drive Tribe, Michael Haffenden.
Hello.
So I will start with the same question I start all of these with. What is your day-to-day like at your job and what are your responsibilities?
It depends quite a lot. Obviously, quite cliche at the minute to say our job roles have changed a fair bit in lockdown and COVID and stuff, but it hasn't really changed too much from my side. I guess it's mainly sort of Monday morning, check over how everything's got done on the weekend, look at all the analytics, that sort of thing, and just plan for the week ahead. A lot of, I guess, something I've focused on this year is planning ahead, just because it's so useful in terms of content and stuff, and just getting. It's nice to know going into a week that you've got ideas and things to be putting out. But yeah, my day to day sort of varies between a fair few meetings. At Drive Tribe, we have quite a few commercial clients, so a lot of the stuff is like paid content, and just talking through clients with that, seeing if they're happy with the content that's going out and seeing if they want to work together in future again. And then a lot of it is just sort of video acquisition, making content and scheduling it really. So even though I'm head of social media, I still do quite a lot of the hands-on stuff as well as the sort of strategy, analytical sort of stuff that goes on behind the scenes.
Sounds very intense. When it comes to like looking at the numbers and stats and everything, is there a certain thing that you pay special attention to, or maybe things that you dismiss? Because I know I personally don't pay attention much to like the age or gender one because I feel like it is irrelevant. But yeah, so do you use any of them, and how much does it influence the work that you do?
Yeah, definitely the age and gender one is quite heavily obviously men for Drive Tribe. But that's something we're looking to change hopefully. But yeah, I guess sort of the main numbers we look at are sort of reach and engagement. They're the two things which we always want to be increasing. And I guess the whole point of Drive Tribe socials is to be quite conversational as well, always asking our audience questions if a new car gets released or something like that, asking their opinion on it, or even just every day at the start of the day, sort of usually in an 8 a.m. sort of slot, ask them a motoring related question, maybe about their first car, their favourite car, the fastest car they've driven, that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess a lot of it comes down to engagement for us, sort of speaking on the Drive Tribe sort of front, and then obviously reach because you want to be growing that each month. But as well, I think it's very easy to get caught up in numbers, especially in a year like this where obviously social media has had a pretty big boom in terms of sort of usage and people being at home. But yeah, I guess another big part of it for me personally is also just having a little look through the comments and checking sentiment, because I think that can easily get lost in the sort of important social metrics you have, where it's like, oh, this a graph of this is doing really well, let's do more of that. But if it's annoying your audience, then it might not be worth it. So it's important to check that sort of how your page is perceived and how your audience are feeling about content. It's important to check that as well and not get too bogged down in the numbers, although ultimately at the end of the day, that's what you're going to be showing your bosses, and that's what really matters, I guess.
Yeah, I love a controversial post on the work accounts. Spice it up a little bit.
You have to do it every now and then.
Are there any other skills that you think are really important when it comes to working in social media?
I think commitment is a massive one. Social media can be really, really fickle. It's something which can definitely obviously have come from quite a journalistic background, and social was pretty new to me when I joined Drive Tribe just over 2 years ago now. I joined as like an assistant social media producer, so I was just sort of doing the day-to-day posting on pages, that sort of thing, helping out where I was needed, and then I've sort of progressed up. And I think I've got a lot better understanding of social now than I did then. But yeah, it can be brilliant, fun social media, and it can also be in equal measure very frustrating, because you don't always know why posts will do well, you don't always know why posts do badly, and you don't always know whether your audience is going to enjoy something. It's always a learning experience. So yeah, it's definitely something you need to sort of I guess, like you just touched on, have a bit of thick skin with, and if your audience don't like something at first, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a write-off. It's just can be a different direction or something like that. But yeah, I think, like you said, resilience, having a bit of thick skin, perseverance, that sort of thing. They're sort of things which go a bit unspoken in the industry because it's just, it comes from experience. Whereas, you know, obviously you need an eye for design, you need an eye for reacting quickly to things and getting posts out there. That's all the stuff that you always hear though, and it's sort of obvious because as consumers of social media, we all know you're more likely to have liked a post if it's breaking news, or if it's something which has just happened, or if it's something which looks really cool and has been put together nicely and has a lot of time put into it. Whereas I think the sort of the other side to it of having to wait for things to grow and be patient and that sort of thing, and you know, people asking, oh, why hasn't this performed well, and not really sometimes having an answer, can get a little bit frustrating. But that's just the nature of social media and algorithms and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know if that's really like a hands-on day-to-day answer, but I think over time working in social is really important not to get disheartened if you don't see the results straight away. And also just being passionate about the subject matter that you're doing helps massively in that respect, because it's easy to sort of think, oh, you know, that didn't perform well, or I could have done a better job on that because the audience didn't like it as much or something like that. And what if you're passionate about what you're doing, then you'll always be sort of striving to improve and that sort of thing. Whereas if, you know, it can get quite disheartening sometimes, and if you're not in the right headspace for it, it can be quite all consuming. So it's definitely important to be passionate about your subject matter and just know, like, nail your basics. That's another social cliche, but like, it doesn't always have to be something that you've spent hours on. Social can be really fickle. Sometimes the post you've spent 15 minutes putting together can do way better than a sort of series that you've put hours into planning, researching, designing, and then scheduling. So yeah, I guess I've gone about this in a very roundabout way, this, but be prepared to sort of go with the flow, and yeah, just be passionate about what you're doing and don't let it get to you if things don't always perform, because ultimately the consistency is what's going to sort of build an audience and grow that.
Yeah, I think passion is a really interesting one, because it's not like you're just on social media for general news. You're working for something that's specifically related to motorsport, which you've been a fan of, like I said earlier, since exiting the womb.
Yeah.
So yeah, that probably helps a lot. But speaking more about motorsport, because you also write articles on the side, or it's part of your job.
Yeah.
There are articles being written. Are there
Yeah,
any skills that you think are essential when it comes to motorsport journalism specifically?
yeah. So since I was at uni, I've been a freelance motorsport journalist. So the sort of Drive Tribe job is, although it is something I'm very invested in and very passionate about, I've always been really keen to sort of continue the journalistic side of things as well. So it would usually be in a race season, I work Monday to Friday at Drive Tribe and then head off to a racetrack for the weekend to freelance, do some freelance journalism, do some freelance PR and social media for some of the teams there, that sort of thing. Obviously, that hasn't happened this year. It's all been remote working, so this has been my racetrack at the weekends. So yeah, motorsport journalism is an interesting one. It's very tight knit, small world of people because it's such a niche sport. Motorsport has always been my sort of niche, as you know, from going to uni with me. All the other lads would be reporting on a football match, and I'd be the only one who's going to a racetrack, which was kind of an advantage, to be honest, because I guess your lecturers get fed up of reading so many football reports. They want to read something different. But yeah, motorsport journalism, it's something I still really love. There's definitely benefits to it that I don't get from the social side, which I would miss if I didn't do it. The sort of on the ground reporting, reacting to breaking news, chatting to drivers and building relationships with teams, that sort of stuff. That's all something that I really enjoy. And you get that from the PR side as well, which I've started doing a lot more of in recent years, where you're sort of, the nice thing about doing the PR is you're in a sort of team environment as well. So you, as a journalist, you're obviously very impartial about something, and I might be reporting at a race weekend on a certain series, and I have to have my journalist hat on, and I have to be, if one of the drivers I'm good mates with has a bad race or they get pole position and win, I still have to report about them in the same way. Whereas if one of the teams I'm doing PR and social media for does really well, I'm obviously really hyped for them, and my posts and my press releases are going to reflect that, because it's like, get in, come on, like very sort of team environment. And equally, it can go the other way. If your race team has a really bad weekend, then it can be really tough to sort of find the wording, or if they make a mistake, that sort of thing. So it's definitely something I've learned a lot doing the last few years.
And I want to talk about your final year project briefly. If people want to find it, is it on YouTube, and what do they have to type in?
Yeah, it's on YouTube. I think it's also on Vimeo.
Richard posted it.
Yeah,
one of our lecturers took it upon himself to post Half's documentary. But yeah, so what do they have to type in on YouTube to find it?
Type in Team Brit on the road to recovery. I think that's the title still.
Yeah, that was
a publication I used to write for also posted it, and it's got more views than my account. So we'll probably do videos with different thumbnails. But yeah, it's on
watch
there.
it on Michael's account then, if you do go and look for it, because that was, we were obviously student journalists at the time, but one of the things that I think made it a really great documentary was the access that you managed to get. You got some really, really personal stories out of it. And do you think maybe it was not easier, because it's still obviously you have to go and find the people, but do you think that motorsport being quite a small community helps you get that access?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it can be sort of a double-edged sword sometimes, the motorsport industry, because it is so niche and everyone knows everyone, that as a student journalist, it's quite hard to break into that because it's such a close-knit little world. I'd say now it'd be a lot easier for me to sort of, as I'm sure a lot of student journalists feel, it'd be way easier for me to sort of phone up someone, or just have a casual chat with a source, rather than having to email them and get their contact details and come at it from the I'm a student journalist at this university kind of thing. But equally, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not like other sort of sports where you'd have to go through someone's manager or their press person or that sort of thing. And it was at a time when the team I was filming with were just starting out in their journey as well. So it's kind of a mutually sort of beneficial thing to do, to have them, talking about their sort of thing, and having me kind of promote it while also, working towards my final year project. So yeah, I think it's something which can work both ways, but it definitely worked in my favour in that account. A lot of the guys that I did the documentary with, I actually did a feature on for I think like an online piece in second year, so I knew quite a few of them anyway, and it was a bit of a no-brainer to sort of continue that story into video. But then it was difficult because it was taking on the TV documentary. I know a lot of our year did it, and it is a very fun thing to do, but it is a massive undertaking, as were all of the final year projects. But sort of, I guess I didn't really have the faith in myself to be able to do it when I started out, just because I didn't feel like I really had the camera skills, or I didn't know how. I knew how much time I'd be spending with the team, and obviously a lot of our course would take someone else with them, and I knew how many days I'd be doing that just really wasn't sustainable to ask someone to come along with me, and then I wouldn't have the time to sort of pay them back in terms of going back and forth with them to help them out as well. So it was very much sort of a lone wolf kind of project, but it was still to this day probably my proudest piece of work. And yeah, something I can always sort of look back on, and maybe in 10 years I'll cringe about how my voice sounds or something like that, but I'll always be proud of the outcome. And I think the response I got to that, obviously getting the NCTJ award was amazing, but the sort of personal responses I got, where members of the team said they watched it, and they're watching it with their wives, and their wives were crying and they were crying, and they're all just so happy with the outcome. And it sort of really hit home when the team manager said, no one's ever told our story in that way before.
I think it's worth remembering as well, for maybe student journalists or people who are just starting out, that even if you don't feel like you have much experience, it's still definitely well worth telling the stories that you want to tell. And so you've mentioned how it's quite a tight-knit community. How would you recommend for people who are wanting to get into motorsport, like to make connections or to network or like worm their way in there a little bit?
Yeah, I guess in many ways it's similar to a lot of other I guess not just the journalism industry, but within the sports journalism industry as well, and that sort of offering your services a lot of the time for free, unfortunately, can really pay dividends. As long as you're getting something beneficial out of it, I would still recommend doing that at very first sort of steps into it. I mean, a lot of the time, just being at racetracks and having your expenses paid, even if you're not getting paid on top of that, can be a massive benefit, because you end up working with people or meeting people who then further your career in other ways. And that's because it is such a close-knit community. That does tend to happen quite a lot. It's a lot of the work I get now comes from recommendations and that sort of thing, whereas before, just being at home, and as great as, I remember setting up a blog in, like, I think it was like Mike's Motorsport blog or something, back in like 2015, and it was good because it allowed me to sort of have my own writing skills and like developing those, but no one really saw it. And also I was just reporting from home, so I wasn't really getting any sort of new angles or actual any sort of exclusive content where other people could just read a race report from someone who's been at the race or interviewed a driver just after, or that sort of thing. So anything where you can sort of offer your services, even if it is remote working at first, if there's sort of potential or scope there to then go to racetracks and interview people, I think that's really important. And again, it comes down a lot of it to passion. I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed a driver and they are expecting me to ask the generic questions they get asked by people who don't really know about motorsport, and they say, "Oh, what's your 0 to 60 in your car?" or "How fast does your car go?" And it's like, if you actually say, "Oh, I grew up watching racing on my dad's shoulders, and I saw your dad racing in this," or like, not on the record stuff, but if you just have a little chat to them before or after, their level of sort of trust in you, and a lot of this doesn't just come down to the casual sort of stuff. A lot of it comes down to making sure every single interview you do, you gain their trust by doing enough research that you know facts about them that other people don't really know, or they might not talk about as much, or they might not be as interested in. And if you sort of have that mentality of always doing enough research and always, doing it as if it's your last interview kind of thing, then going forward, these people will always sort of trust you and feel like, oh, I'd love to do an interview of that guy again, or recommend them to someone else. So I think, again, a lot of it comes down to passion, and massively it comes down to offering out your services, because at the end of the day there are still vacancies to be filled and jobs to be done, even though it is such a sort of tight-knit community, as we've said.
Yeah. And with people wanting to like offer their services or do some writing if it's unpaid, is that just like you'll go and find a publication and find an email and then just get in contact that way, or have you found success through anything else?
Yeah, pretty much that, to be honest. A lot of it comes down to sort of seeing, I know it's something that you mentioned when you did your Channel 5 interview, talking about, you mentioned they didn't really post much on their Instagram or something like
Yeah.
that. I know that's more touching on the social side as opposed to the journalistic side, but it applies for both sort of worlds, if you like, where if you sort of spot a gap where you could be really useful, an employer's always going to be way more likely to take you on, or at least have a view of taking you on in the future when they have the resource or the money or something like that. Um, a lot of it comes down to sort of, in the motorsport journalism world, seeing a lot of series get the same amount of coverage. So like Formula One is obviously the pinnacle of motorsport. It gets so much coverage. There's almost no point trying to write, unless that's the only sort of motorsport you're interested in. There's almost no point starting out being like, oh, I want to write about F1 because someone who's like an editor of a website will already have someone who's got years of experience doing that, and they'll probably, you know, have a backlog of people they could who they really trust have like running that anyway. So you should really try and spot the gaps. What do they cover? What could they cover a bit better? What's local to you? I mean, I'm really lucky with me going to uni at Kent and living in Kent. I had Brands Hatch just down the road. So, and a lot of the drivers who race there are local drivers. So I could always use the sort of Kent angle in any story that we did for like the local uni paper or something like that. So yeah, again, I guess a lot of it is spotting those sort of gaps like we've touched on before, and that definitely applies to both social and the journalistic worlds, because as I said, an employers, if you can make yourself really useful to them aside from just the day-to-day stuff they want you to do, then you're way more likely to sort of get that.
Yeah. And when it comes to really like perfecting your craft and stuff, I guess it's different for people in court reporting or sports reporting, because that's a very obvious NCTJ module and it's something that will be probably taught as well in the courses. But for motorsport, do you think that you really benefited from doing a journalism degree and then having the NCTJ as part of that? Or would you say like motorsport careers are attainable just with work experience and things like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think a lot of it, personally, I think it really helped me just to gain confidence in writing, because as well as sort of covering all the bases in terms of what not to do in the NCTJ and our university course that we did, just gaining the experience of always sort of writing up these stories, and so it just becomes second nature, basically, almost as if you're doing shorthand. Like, it just, you see a story and you're already sort of writing the intro without even really thinking. I think that really helped me in terms of building confidence and stuff. However, I don't think necessarily it's essential. I know a lot of colleagues I've worked with in the motorsport industry don't have NCTJ qualifications, or they didn't even do a journalism degree. So I wouldn't say it's essential. Again, a lot of the sort of necessary skills comes through your knowledge of the sport and your passion for the sport, in terms of, and obviously your previous experience, rather than, oh, I've got a degree in this. And, you know, I think definitely freelancing on the side in journalism throughout my uni degree was something that set me apart, rather than just relying on the NCTJ stuff, which is obviously fantastic to have. And if I'd pursued a career more directly in motorsport journalism, I think it would have been something which was quite a big, you know, check off the list for an employer looking. So personally, yeah, I'm really glad I did it, but I wouldn't say it's an essential thing for someone wanting to get into the industry. I think it's just, again, comes down to gaining experience and showing your passion for the sort of the sport itself,
Yeah.
which can really sort of win over an employer.
And do you have any last words of wisdom for aspiring motorsport journalists?
Um, words of wisdom. Uh, don't give up. I know that's very sort of cliche, but it's something which, like I said earlier, with the social media stuff, sometimes things don't always go your way. Sometimes other people will get a gig that you'd love to get, that sort of thing. But if you work hard and you always sort of have the right principles about you of you know, respecting clients or sources or teams or whoever it is, and I guess this doesn't just apply to the motorsport industry either. I think it can really pay dividends, just building those relationships and not giving up, when, because the hours you end up doing in the motorsport industry are actually quite ridiculous. I remember sort of telling a lot of our friendship group at uni about the hours I'd put in on a race weekend, and I wouldn't even be getting paid at that time. It was just all expenses paid or something like that. And you guys would be like, why on earth are you doing that? They're like, are you crazy? And a lot of the time that's the stuff that will set you apart, because if you're the last one out of the media centre, it really shows your commitment, that sort of thing. So yeah, don't give up is a very cliched term, but I think it's something which is really important, especially because it is such a niche little industry and it's quite hard to break into. And also enjoy it. It's so easy to get caught up in especially years like this, to get caught up in numbers and maybe feeling like you're not progressing as much as you could or that sort of thing. But even the day-to-day stuff, working in an industry that you're really passionate about, can actually be really cool. And a lot of the time I use the sort of, what would 10-year-old Half think if you know, he knew I'd spoken to this driver today, or I'd interviewed this guy last week, or that sort of thing. So having perspective on stuff is also pretty important, I'd say. And that's all the cliches I have for this one.
That was going to be my last question, but I just thought of another one. Is there anything aside from the hours you put in, and maybe that it's also quite a small community, is there anything that you think people might not know about motorsport journalism and the industry?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot actually, that it's all very, very sort of behind the scenes, and it's because it's such a niche, you don't really get to see what it involves. I know personally, going into my first like race weekend, I was really quite nervous for it because I knew what sort of jobs I'd be doing, but I didn't have any experience of it, and I didn't really have any sort of behind the scenes knowledge of how it actually works. Luckily, I was very, very fortunate to be working with someone in the very early days who I still work with now, but he sort of showed me the ropes quite a lot. And you know, it's quite old school motorsport journalism in that you're going round into like team trucks and through the paddock asking drivers for interviews, and sometimes they're in a great mood, sometimes they've just crashed, or they've made a mistake and got a massive penalty, or they've lost their championship. So you're thrown in the deep end in some really difficult situations where it can really test the sort of journalist to driver or journalist to team manager relationship. If things are going great, then it's obviously very easy to chat to people about how things are going. If things are going badly, you really sort of have to judge, are they happy to speak to me? Are they going to say anything that I can actually publish? Because you can catch a driver who's just had a 150-mile-an-hour accident, he's not likely to say something which is going to be publishable. And also you've got to think about, is this going to sort of damage the relationship I have with them further down the line if I'm being like, oh, can I grab a quick word if something really bad has happened? So it's quite weirdly old school in the sense that it's a very personal sort of thing. And drivers really don't forget what you publish about them either. I know it can be sort of something with, when I started out, I thought, you know, there's a lot of niche readers who will want to read this, but the drivers probably don't check it. They just turn up and drive. But this is their whole life, so they really do. There's a few drivers who will sift through the reports from the weekend and say, "Oh, I don't want to chat to you, mate," or like give you a bit of banter. Oh, I sort of read what you wrote about me last weekend, or something like that, and you're like, "Oh God!" Like they actually, people do read this stuff, so it is really important to always be confident in what you're publishing and not breach that sort of trust that you get. But yeah, I guess in terms of what people don't know about it is, again, comes down to the experience of go out and do it, because that's the best way you can learn. And also if you meet other journalists who have who've been through similar experiences or have interviewed the same drivers who might not always be the nicest people, then you really bond with them over like, oh, he said the same thing to me, or that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question really, but it's a very, very weird sort of industry, but definitely one that's cool to get into if you're really passionate about it.